Hi everyone! In this video, we'll talk about the UDM console. The UDM console is a tool that allows for debugging applications in the form runner. To open the UDM console, in the form runner, press Ctrl-Q or Command-Q on the keyboard. As you can see, the console has 4 tabs: Console, UDML Functions, Form Structure, and Profiling. However, before we look closer at these tabs, there is a very important thing to mention. One can work in the UDM console only in those applications that have the Launch Application in Debugging Mode property enabled. It is highly recommended to enable this property only in development and test platform instances, because the UDM console allows for accessing and editing database data directly. Let's start with the most important functionality of the UDM console, which is its ability to access the context of the form we are currently on. Here, it's important to remember that forms can be not only simple, but also can contain nested forms whose context can also be accessed. For example, this form with the client table contains a nested form that appears when double-clicking on some client in the table. We'll talk about this nested form later. But first, let's work with the context of the current form. The current form has an attribute named client form. We can see that so far this attribute is empty. Let's select a client from the table and see how the value of this attribute changes. To repeat an expression in the console, you can either click on it or place the cursor in the input field and use the up and down arrows on the keyboard. Now we can see that the client form attribute stores the client we have just selected. Now let's try to access the context of the nested form mentioned earlier. We know that the current form contains a pop-up window, which in turn contains the client data nested form. This nested form contains the attributes client and result. Let's try to access the client attribute in the console. The console returns an error saying that the current form's context does not contain the field client, which is completely true. If we look at the attributes of this form, we'll see that it doesn't have any attribute named client. If we want to access this attribute of the nested form, we need to do so in the context of that form. To access the context of the nested form, double-click on a client in the table. This will open the pop-up window mentioned earlier that contains the nested form that we are talking about. Now, if we call the client attribute in the console again, we'll see that there is no error anymore and that this attribute stores the client that we have just double-clicked on. In the meantime, though, if we try to access an attribute of the main form again, we'll get an error saying that the current context, which is now the context of the nested form, does not contain this field. Therefore, when working in the UDM console, please be very careful and pay attention to the context you are dealing with. Next, let's look at the Form Structure tab. This tab presents all form widgets as a hierarchical structure. On this tab, when a widget is selected from the list, the calculated values of its properties are displayed on the right. Some properties specify both the ID of the UDML expression used for the calculation and the result of this calculation. The result depends on the type of the property and on which values it can take in the system. For example, yes or no for Boolean properties or numbers for numerical properties. Some properties may have one of the predefined system values, while object and collection properties will have an indication like object or collection next to them. Apart from viewing property values, we can change some of them. Mostly it's the values of some simple properties that are supported in the runtime. For example, we can change the visibility of this pop-up window. Here, it's important to note that all these changes we are making are applied only to the current form runner session, which means only to the current page opened in the form runner by the current user. Another important thing to note is that when selecting nested forms or widgets that have their own context, the ID of the context displayed in the context field changes. For example, we already know that the nested form has its own context. We can select this form on the Form Structure tab, then go to the Console tab and call one of its attributes like we did before. If now we go back to the Form Structure tab and select the table and then return to the Console tab and repeat the expression, we'll get an error because we have switched to the context of the table. This way, we can monitor the form structure and the configuration of its widgets. Apart from selecting widgets in the structure, we can click the arrow icon and select them directly on the form to see how they are configured. Now, let's talk about the UDML Functions tab. This tab displays the list of all functions and methods that exist in Platform. To get the function you need, you can either use the search bar or find it manually in the list. For example, the search method by ID. When clicking on a function or method, information about it is displayed on the right. This information includes the description of the function or method, its signature, input parameters, return value, and examples of use. When double-clicking on a function or method, it's automatically inserted in the console. Let's complete this method for this form. For example, we want to know whether or not the client with ID 2 exists. After calling the method, we can see that this client exists and view the data of this client object. Here, we can test any expressions we might need. For example, we can access the first name field to learn the client's name, or the address field to see where this client lives. If we try to access an object that doesn't exist, the method will return null. Let's take another example, the text function. This function returns the concatenation of collection elements. If we use this function incorrectly, the console will notify us that something has gone wrong. This gives us an opportunity to debug this function and any other UDML functions or methods where we could have made a mistake. While we are on this tab, let's see what happens on the Network tab of the browser console when we are working in the UDM console. Let's repeat one of the previous expressions. We can see that a console record has appeared on the Network tab. This is a platform request. Like any other platform request, it's included in a UDM queue. Here, we can see the expression that was sent in this request and type of the request, which is a UDML calculation. In the response, in the val object, we can see the data type of the return value, in this case, string. If we test the very first expression we used, its return data type will be different. Sometimes, this information can be very helpful when debugging UDML expressions. Finally, the last tab, Profiling, allows for measuring the execution time of UDML expressions on the form. To do this, click Start Profiling and perform the needed actions on the form. In our case, let's enter a number in the phone number field and click Search to find clients with this number. Once you've performed all the needed actions, click Stop Profiling. As you can see, the record of this profiling session has appeared on the history list. You can open this record to see the breakdown of all operations performed during the session. For convenience, it's recommended to set the time unit to milliseconds because this way it's just easier to analyze the data. The operations are arranged by the execution time in ascending order. Here we can see that the longest operation was executing the paginate function. If some script was executed during a profiling session, you can view the content of the script by clicking on it. This way, we can measure the execution time of certain fragments of the application's functionality and optimize them if necessary. What's really nice about profiling is that these statistics can be downloaded in the XLS format. Let's try applying everything we've learned so far to an actual case where we need to debug a form. Let's select a client from the table and double-click on their name. Like before, a pop-up window appears, but this time it's empty, despite the fact that we have selected a client. Let's try to figure out why this is the case. We know that the main form has the attribute client form. Let's see what value this attribute stores. To do this, on the Form Structure tab, make sure to select the main form so that we are working in its context. On the Console tab, call the Client Form attribute. We can see that it stores one object, which is the client we have just selected from the table. In the meantime, the pop-up window contains a nested form, and this nested form has the attribute Client. In a similar way, using the UDM console, we can see what value this attribute stores. To do this, in the form structure, select the nested form to switch to its context, and then, on the Console tab, call its attribute Client. We can see that this attribute is empty. This way, we have located the problem, and now know that it occurs at the point where the context of the parent form meets the context of the nested form. This meeting point is located right here. And indeed, we can see that the attributes of the nested form are not connected to the attributes of the parent form. If we map the client attribute of the nested form to the client form attribute of the parent form, the pop-up window will display all the needed data. This way, the UDM console can help us identify and locate errors, which allows us to fix them. I hope you have a great time working in the UDM console, and I will see you next time.